Alright, so here's a book review on DMT, the Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman, a doctor's revolutionary research into the biology of near-death experiences and mystical experiences. It's actually quite a good book on DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which he actually does go into detail on its molecular structure and things like that. Not a very lengthy book, but it does start off with the first sessions that he's actually been able to test on subjects. He actually got the okay by the government in order to have, I think it was David Nichols, synthesize DMT, the dimethyltryptamine, and actually had the okay to inject it, not smoke it, but inject it in a controlled fashion. They actually had a hospital room where they would actually go in and have the patients experience this. In the first part of the book, basically the prologue, he goes over the first sessions that he gave in about 1990. I think it was December of 1990. He gave it to Philip and Nils. They're both previously DMT users. They've used it before by smoking it. Basically, they said that when you smoke it, it's a startling, rapid onset of kaleidoscopic display of visual hallucinations and a separation of consciousness from the physical body. Basically, they did it intravenous, basically through needle use. That's when Strassman actually, administered it to them. He goes through, talks about the psychedelic threshold, which is basically crossed when there's a separation of consciousness from the body and the psychedelic effects completely replace the mind's normal contents. There's a sense of wonder and awe and a feeling of undeniable certainty in the reality of the experience. He claims that there is a rush, which is the hallmark of smoking DMT. During the rush, which usually happens within 15 to 30 seconds after smoking the DMT, you shift from a normal consciousness to an overwhelming psychedelic reality, which takes place just very fast. It's probably one of those drugs that's pretty crazy, and most of you watching this either would like to try it, or have tried it, or are too afraid to try it. Do what you want to do and do it up. And yeah, it was David Nichols, who is a PhD, and he was at Purdue University of Indiana. He was a colleague in the DMT experiment itself. I believe he actually wrote a lot about the discovery of the psychedelic properties of the Samoan desert toad, which also has the DMT in it. But that one is the 5-methoxy DMT. It's very closely related to regular DMT, which is found in just about more plants than not. You do actually have to extract quite a bit of it in order to have the effects. Now then we get into part one, which is basically the building blocks. He goes through, the psychedelic drugs, the science and society behind it. Pretty interesting chapter itself. Talks about LSD, the chemists who created LSD, or synthesized it, I guess, not created, which would be Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, probably right around 1938. Talks a bit more about the use of LSD and its psychedelic properties, how it was produced, all that good stuff there. Maybe the biological psychiatry, the discipline that studies the relationship between the human mind and the brain chemistry. It also goes into serotonin and the neurotransmitters which are used. Basically, neurotransmitters allow chemical communications among the nerve cells in the brain. A transmitting cell releases a neurotransmitter, which then attaches to specialized receptor sites on the receiving cell. This docking of transmitter to receptor begins a sequence of events ending in the release of the receiving cell's own neurotransmitter, and the process continues down the line. Other well-known neurotransmitters are norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, all that good stuff there. Basically talks about setting, which is the conditions in order to actually study this use. The set basically would be long-term and immediate, past or present, and our potential future preferences, ideas, habits, and feelings. Set also includes our body and our brain. Also a setting, who or what or isn't in our immediate surroundings, the environment we're in, whether natural, urban, indoor, outdoor, quality. All of these sorts of things can actually affect the way that these psychedelics come in contact with our mind. If you're in the wrong set and setting, you can have a bad trip. I'm sure most of you heard of bad trips before. Using too much of the drug in a setting where you're not used to can also create this bad setting. So he talks a bit about that. There's a big structure of the molecular structures of mescaline, MDMA, just different tryptamines, ibogaine, DMT, serotonin. So he actually doesn't leave you without these structures, but he will actually go into depth on it. Different compounds like the nightshade family. So he doesn't really just talk about DMT, but there is a lot more about other hallucinogenics as well. Tells you what DMT is in chapter 2. DMT is basically dimethyltryptamine. It exists in our bodies and our brain and throughout the plant kingdom and in the animal kingdom. DMT became the first endogenous human psychedelic. Basically, endogenous means that a compound is made in the body. Endo means within, and genus, generated or formed. Basically showing that we do produce DMT, and the way it actually sends it back and forth, all that good stuff, and how it transports it from the blood-brain barrier. Talks about the pineal gland, which is basically what most people believe that DMT is actually produced through. Basically, the pineal gland of evolutionary older animals, such as lizards and amphibians, is so-called the third eye. Just like the two seeing eyes, the third eye possesses a lens, cornea, and retina. It's light sensitive and helps regulate body temperature and skin coloration, two basic survival functions immediately related to environmental light. Rick Strassman also did a lot of studies on melatonin, another neurotransmitter involved with the process of sleeping, which he actually goes in a little bit in detail on his studies on melatonin. Basically, it's produced in the pineal gland as well. It's kind of a hormone. So yeah, it talks a lot about the pineal gland itself, how the pineal gland is formed, which is a pretty interesting process. It's basically not actually part of the brain. It develops from specialized tissues in the root of the fetal mouth. From there, it migrates to the center of the brain. Additionally, it sits in a strategic closeness to the crucial emotional and sensory brain centers. These sensory or perceptual hubs are called the visual and auditory colliculi, little mounds of separated brain tissue. They are relay stations for the transmission of sense data to brain sites involved in the registrations and interpretation. Electrical, chemicals, impulse that begin in the eyes and ears must pass through the colliculi before we experience them as sights or sounds. The pineal gland hangs directly over these colliculi, separated by only a narrow channel of cerebral spinal fluid. Anything secreted by the pineal into that fluid would settle on the colliculi in a moment. In addition, the limbic or emotional brain surrounds the pineal. The limbic system is a collection of brain structures intimately involved in the experience and feelings such as joy, rage, fear, anxiety, and pleasure. Therefore, the pineal gland has direct access to the brain's emotional centers. A little bit more on melatonin throughout the book as well. It goes into chapter 4, which is the psychedelic pineal. Talks about the psychedelic compounds of the pineal gland itself. You go into part 2, which is conception and birth. A little bit about neuroendocrinology, basically the study of how drugs influence hormones by first stimulating certain brain sites, which is pretty interesting as well. Chapter 6 is the labyrinth. Goes through the hardships of receiving the okay of performing the DMT studies, what he had to do in order to get the authorization saying yes, it's okay if you go ahead and study these. Also goes through being a volunteer, what volunteers actually had to meet in order to fit the criteria of actually being able to use it. Goes over the room where the DMT is injected and studied, the atmosphere, the feelings of the room before they injected it. I think a lot of times he leaves out the actual names of the people actually using the DMT for security purposes and things like that. So that one gets into the set and the setting. Chapter 8 goes into how he got the DMT. All of the hardships it took for him to get in there and actually find this DMT to study it. Chapter 9 basically is under the influence. Chapter speaks of the different visuals, sounds, feelings, and influences of the DMT. So it kind of digs in deep on the effects. And also chapter 10 is introduction to the case reports. This chapter tells how and what ways things were done and gathered with the experiences of the DMT. Basically, what he did with his studies, things like that. The personal DMT experiences, invisible, transpersonal. Chapter 11 is feeling and thinking. Goes over the feelings of thinking of the volunteers during, before, and after their usage of DMT. Chapter 12 is called Unseen Worlds. This chapter goes into the worlds of DMT and the vision seen, numerical numbers and letters, ruins and DNA-like structures, almost like a dream state with all sorts of rather dreamlike situations. So basically, taking this DMT puts you in a dream state. I'm sure if you've heard Terence McKenna speak about his dimethyltryptamine use, he says that there's a lot of machine elves, all sorts of different type of mechanical world, quite an intense portion of your mind producing these effects while on that substance itself. Chapter 13 calls Contact Through the Veil. There's actually a couple chapters on that itself. Basically the difference of beings and realms that the volunteers journey through, usually on their last dosage of the DMT. Goes into alien, elves, jokers, carnival beings, different beings that are sought throughout the use of the DMT itself. Contact Through the Veil 2. This chapter actually explains two of the volunteers' very vivid interactions with the spiritual world. The end explains the very similar events and settings DMT gives, along with its similarities to alien abductions. John Mack is mentioned, and his studies with alien encounters and their experiences. If you don't know who John Mack is, he's a psychiatrist who actually studied a lot of the effects of people who claim to be abducted by aliens, things like that. Kind of seems as though maybe these alien abductions could be an overproduction of DMT in your brain, which then causes these different entities to come into your mind. So that's another interesting subject that this book kind of puts out there for you to think about. Also talks about in chapter 15 death and dying. This chapter here would begin with near-death experiences and the properties that are given when this occurrence happens. Then it goes on to explain some of the volunteers' deaths and rebirth experiences while under the influences of DMT. Chapter 16 is mystical states, basically different states and types and religious effects that it causes. Chapter 17, pain and fear, basically bad trips that people might have had while using this DMT. Frightening experiences, high or low blood pressure that affected the outcome, possibly damaging to the volunteer. Maybe it caused a bad reaction to where they didn't necessarily want to do this again, things like that. And then chapter 18 kind of goes into follow-up on the subjects itself down the road on the effects that must have gave them. Mostly he says that there was no profound changes, yet a few follow-ups reported a stronger sense of self, less fear of death, greater appreciation of life. Some also found that they were better able to relax. Some drank less. Some claimed to be more sensitive to the other psychedelics. It's an interesting chapter if you want to know the outcome. Chapter 19 is winding down. Basically, that one goes through the hardships and studies and talks about psilocybin LSD studies. Also some of the conflicts with people working with Strassman on research, bad trip a lady must have had, and the serious thought of discontinuing the research altogether. Because I guess with the set and the setting that he was actually involved with, he actually used, didn't seem as though the proper place to actually try to study natural effects of DMT. Chapter 20 calls it Stepping on the Holy Toes. It talks about where Rick Strassman was born, raised, also his study with Buddhism. A couple other things on that one there. Kind of an interesting one to kind of closing up the story of it itself. Chapter 21 is basically called DMT, the spirit molecule. He kind of goes in and explains why he claims that it could be a spirit molecule itself. He says that it is almost inconceivable that a chemical as simple as DMT could provide access to such an amazingly varied array of experiences, from the least dramatic to the most earth-shattering, from psychological insights to encounters with aliens, abject terror of nearly unbearable bliss, near-death and rebirth, enlightenment, all of these are naturally occurring. A chemical cousin to serotonin, which is widespread in the central brain neurotransmitter. Quite a bit in that chapter there, which is extremely interesting itself. Just trying to go over if there's anything else I've left off for that one there. Talks about side effects. Chapter 22 is the future of psychedelic research. Basically, if it's actually reasonable to study the effects and try to use them in more of a psychiatric sense, to try to get people to basically mend connections with other harmful drugs, things like that. Then there's an epilogue which goes through just a little bit more about his studies, just in a little more brief form. Then, obviously in that book there, he actually gives references to quite a few other really good books on hallucinogens. People from R. Gordon Wasson to John Marco Allegro, which I don't believe he actually mentions Allegro. I'll probably go ahead and do a book review on John Marco Allegro, which a lot of you are probably familiar with The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Dead Sea Scrolls and Christian Myth, all that kind of good stuff. But yeah, basically this book was a really good one. If you like the study of psychedelics, sorry it was kind of fast and not too explanative, but then again, if you actually want to get more in depth, grab this book, read it, figure out what's going on. I've personally never tried DMT, which kind of sucks. Kind of hard to find a good compilation of the DMT molecule itself without thinking that I'm doing something random. Obviously, I wouldn't inject it. That's just crazy. But yeah, this book here has kind of raised my mind on different studies that people have been doing on it. There's a lot of good stuff about Rick Strassman on YouTube. DMT, the spirit molecule. If you don't want to read the book, you can check that out. He goes into depth on it as well, which is probably a lot more in depth than I can give you. But yeah, this one here has really opened my mind and made me think in a whole lot of different fashions than I'm used to, just because of it being an endogenous compound. I believe that we actually produce it while we're dreaming. Probably not in extreme doses, but enough to where it actually gives us the visual effects of our mind, things like that. I mean, other than that, here's my first book review. Hopefully they get better as I can set them up better, things like that. But anyways, this is non-fiction, and you guys have a good one.